So my papa, David Kipnis, was the bar mitzvah tutor at Congregation Shereth Israel in San Francisco, California in the 1970s and 80s. He owned a liquor store during the day, and he was the bar mitzvah tutor in the afternoon, I guess, probably not at night, but in the afternoon. It was the original gig economy, his side hustle. My grandmother was the confirmation teacher in that same Reformed synagogue in San Francisco, a historic Reformed synagogue in San Francisco. If you've ever been, it's the one with the dome. It's not Temple Emmanuel. They had all the money. Shereth Israel, I'll say, had all the worker Jews. But it's where the UN Charter was actually signed in San Francisco, or the League of Nations, not the UN. Anyhow, that was the family synagogue. You could say that I entered the family business, so to speak. My papa died 30 years ago, and like many who knew our grandparents before we ourselves became adults and entered into our careers and had families, I often wonder what he would think of the world that we live in today. What would he think? Would he think that things are better with the internet, with 500 channels on television and nothing on, with cell phones and DoorDash and Uber and all sorts of other things? Or would he, like many I know, long for a simpler time? The romanticized version of a bygone era when everything and every family was like Leave It to Beaver. All wars were between good and evil, and good won. Politics was never personal, and every family had a home and could afford a vacation once or twice a year. That time, of course, never existed, except in our mind. Leave It to Beaver was as fantastical then as Star Trek is, I want to say now, but something else is probably more fantastical than Star Trek. But we don't remember it that way. What started me thinking about this, and why I started with my grandfather, the bar mitzvah tutor, was a packet of letters that I got in the mail early this week. See, the rabbi of that Congregation Shereth Israel, where my papa and my grandmother were such active members, was Rabbi Marty Weiner. And Rabbi Weiner died last year, Alev Sholom. His son, Danny, who has an excellent name, also became a rabbi, and he's a rabbi at Temple DeHersh Sinai in Seattle, Washington, just over the border. And we're friends. Earlier this week, I got a big envelope from Rabbi Weiner, the younger, and in it was a stack of handwritten notes that my papa had prepared about each of his bar mitzvah students as monthly reports to Rabbi Weiner, the elder. And these are those handwritten notes. With his son's thoughtful effort, what had been in my papa's hand, and then in Rabbi Weiner's hand, is now in my hands. They are remarkable in how unremarkable they are. Let me read you just a few sentences of a couple. And my papa had handwriting that it really challenges me, but it was beautiful handwriting, just not what I'm used to. Let's see. Eric Sweet, just 11 years old. He lives in Marin County. His mother was very unhappy with the prayers in the Hebrew school. I first met Eric in November of 1978, and he had no idea whatsoever of what he had been doing in our school. We're making progress now. His Hebrew primer is doing better work. He can read some Siddur phrases, but he has a long way to go. Daniel Benjamin, bar mitzvah in June of 1980. David. First met David in November of 78. He was having problems in the Hebrew school. He is still having difficulty with the fundamentals and is slowly maturing, but this will take a long time. I could go on. I met Jonathan. This is Jonathan Franklin. There are girls on here too. I just happened to pick these three. I met with Jonathan the first time last week. His comprehension of the vowels is very poor, and his preparation of the letters, her perception of the letters are faulty as well. He was happy to learn of the reader and the help, and I hope that I gave Jonathan a thorough review workout, and then we concentrated on reading so that the cantor, when working with him, would not be so challenged. It goes on. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Ein chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new under the sun, Kohelet wrote in Ecclesiastes. Meaning that things that we assume have never before existed or happened have their origins in something that we already have or know have experienced, that already has or we have experienced. And when I read these notes, I thought of a letter that I first read in rabbinical school in a class on American Jewish history, which by definition is not that old, American Jewish history, compared to Jewish history in general, which is thousands of years old. And this letter was written in the 1830s. And it was sent by the rabbi and the temple president to every single student and their parents in the congregation. Nearly 200 years ago, it said something to the effect of, quote, if students do not show up at synagogue on Saturday mornings and do not participate more regularly in the service, they will not be afforded the honor of having a bar mitzvah. It was only bar mitzvahs back then. Students and parents must do a better job of honoring their commitment to Torah and the congregation if they want to have this honor in front of our congregation. Now, the letter stood out for me then, and it stayed with me for 25 years because, like my papa's notes, it could have been written yesterday, that letter of 200 years ago. It could have been written by me. In fact, I know I have sent a similar letter like that at some point in my rabbinate, probably more than once. We have this habit of romanticizing the past, a cognitive tendency to selectively remember the past as better than it was, especially when the present isn't so great and doesn't feel so good. And I hear this a lot. I hear it a lot lately in conversations with other parents. And it's not just about longing for the good old days. It also reflects a deep dissatisfaction, maybe even a resignation, with the state of the world and the society that we currently live in. I think I first started to feel old when I caught myself criticizing the choices of current generations in their work habits, in their parenting, in their politics, and all the things that we use to measure the relative success of one generation compared to another. I first caught myself effectively starting a sentence by saying something like, kids these days, and finish that sentence with a sigh, or in my case, more likely, an oi. And I knew then two things. One, that I was old, or older, and two, that I was using a very selective memory in elevating the work ethics and values and civic culture of my own generation over that of the present. And how many of us have looked at someone maybe in tattoos or multicolored hair or many manner of trendy clothing that we don't quite understand and rolled our eyes figuratively or actually and said something to the effect of, well, I never. Maybe our own experiences in Hebrew school, if we have had them, is an exception to the rule. Maybe no one remembers those days as full of rainbows and unicorns, your days in Sunday school. I once overheard a father say to their child, quote, I hated Hebrew school. Your grandfather hated Hebrew school, and so you will hate Hebrew school. That's how it's supposed to be. That's how God intended it. That's the meaning of Lador Vador, la generation to generation, end quote. Really, I heard a father say that. I will not comment on whether or not I might be related to that father. But more often, so many things are simply not as bad or as good as we remember them to be. There's a common misconception that memories are accurate records of the past, pristinely preserved mental filing cabinets. They are not. Memory doesn't really work like that. Ann Wilson, a professor of psychology at the Wilfrid Laurier University, whose research broadly focuses on memory and time and identity, she said, we reconstruct what happened in the past on the basis of little bits and pieces of memory. We're acting like archaeologists, picking up the pieces and putting them back together. This doesn't mean we consciously distort or embellish our memories, but the process of retrieving memories is highly reconstructive and prone to various biases. Which brings me then to one of my favorite images in the whole of the Torah, and it occurs in this week's Parashat, in Parashat Ekev, the Torah portion that Etan and Marty and Katrina are going to chant tomorrow morning. In the Parsha, from the middle of this book of Deuteronomy, which is the last book in the Torah, a recounting of the whole story of the Israelites from the time they left Egypt until they come to the promised land and enter into the land. Because remember, this 35 or so chapters of Deuteronomy is just one long speech by Moses. And he's kind of standing there at the shore of the sea and says, wait, before we go in, I just want to say one thing. And then he goes on for an entire book of the Torah. And we have in there the retelling of the story of the golden calf and the first set of tablets and then the second set of tablets. Remember, there were two sets. So, leaving aside for a moment what happened at the golden calf, if you're going to retell the story of the Jewish people in a summary, in a nutshell, why does Moses include that story? Why include the time when they rebelled against God? Why include the time when they were so scared that they melted down their jewelry and the rings from their ears into a golden calf and they bowed down and prayed to it? You saw the movie, Charlton Heston, you saw it. Why put that in? And the answer comes from the imagery that is in this Parsha, because it speaks very eloquently about the broken tablets. That first set. Remember, Moses comes down the mountain, sees them dancing with the golden calf, and he smashes the tablets into what I assume is dozens of pieces. And then he has this argument with God, and God says, I'll get you a new people. You deserve better than this. We can do better. And Moses says, no, you can't do that. Because then what are they going to say? You brought us out of Egypt just to kill them. You can't do that, God. That's not good for you or for me. And so they work it out, and Moses goes back up the mountain, and that first set, God carved with God's divine hand, right? And fire, and white fire, and black flame. The second set Moses has to do with his own hand. 40 days and 40 nights again. Comes back down this time, right, with the next set. But the question, and it's answered in our Parsha, or at least in the Midrash, is what happened to that first set? Those are holy tablets. You can't sell that on eBay. I guess you could. You could make a fortune. That's God's handiwork. And the answer is they put those broken sets of tablets, all those shards, all those pieces, into the Ark of the Covenant. You saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's the thing we're talking about. They put it into the Ark of the Covenant. And then on top of that, Moses, Aaron, the Israelites placed the whole set, the second set of tablets, the ones that Moses carved by hand. And they schlepped that through the desert for 40 years, twice as heavy as it would have been. Why? Because of memory. Because the good old days weren't always good old days. And the brokenness, our mistakes, they serve as a foundation for our wholeness. They serve as a foundation for who we grow and become to be. And our Parsha and our tradition teach us something that my papa's notes taught me, that letter from the 1830s teaches us. Remember it as it was. Not rainbows and unicorns and glossing over the difficult parts, the hard parts, the broken parts. Remember the hard parts, because that's where growth comes. We don't learn anything from our successes. We learn everything from our mistakes. And it's right there in the Parsha. I loved reading these notes because it reminds me that rabbis and Jewish educators and cantors have been struggling with this same challenge, and we still haven't gotten it right, although it's better at our school than it was there. We still haven't gotten it right in however many years it has been, but we're working on it. And we shouldn't romanticize it to think that every child that went to Hebrew school pre-1980 was a scholar and a scribe and chanted the whole Torah and knew the prayers backwards and forwards. No, they didn't. Your parents didn't either. But if we remember that, we can learn from it. We can keep working on it. But if we gloss over it, we've lost it all. The broken tablets, those broken shards that are in your life of your own mistakes, they're the foundation for your wholeness. They're the foundation upon which we will grow and have successes and learn. And that's what our Torah teaches us. Shabbat Shalom.